There was a small, quiet street in a peaceful town. It was the kind of street where mornings began slowly. Birds sang from the trees. Neighbors opened their windows to let in the fresh air, and the smell of coffee sometimes drifted gently from one house to another. At the corner of that street stood a small white house. The paint on the fence was slightly faded. The garden was simple but full of life. Small flowers grew beside the path. A wooden bench rested under a tree. And every morning, soft light touched the windows of the kitchen. This was the home of a woman named Margaret. Margaret was not famous. She was not rich. And very few people outside the neighborhood knew her name. But inside that small house, something very special happened every day. Margaret had lived there for more than 30 years. The house had once been full of noise and movement. Her husband had lived there with her. Her children had grown up running through the hallway. There had been laughter at the dinner table, birthday cakes in the kitchen, and busy mornings when everyone was rushing somewhere. But time changes many things. Her husband passed away many years ago. Her children had grown up and moved to different cities. The once busy house slowly became quiet. At first, Margaret felt the silence very strongly. The kitchen felt too large for one person. The dining table had too many empty chairs. Even the sound of the clock on the wall felt louder than before. But Margaret was not the kind of person who allowed sadness to stay too long. Instead, she kept her daily routine. She woke up early every morning. She opened the kitchen window to let the morning air inside. She made tea, and then she began cooking breakfast. Cooking had always been something she loved. Even when her children were young, Margaret believed food could bring comfort to people. A warm meal could calm a worried mind. A bowl of soup could make someone feel cared for. And a simple dinner could bring people together. After her family moved away, Margaret continued cooking every day. It gave her purpose. It filled the house with warm smells again. But one quiet afternoon, something happened that changed her routine forever. Margaret had gone to the market to buy vegetables. The weather was cool and gray that day. The streets were busy with people walking quickly past each other. As Margaret walked home, she noticed a man sitting on a bench near the bus stop. He looked tired, his clothes were worn, and he was staring quietly at the ground. Margaret slowed her steps. She noticed something else. The man looked hungry. Margaret did not know his story. She did not know where he came from or what had happened in his life. But she recognized the quiet look of someone who had not eaten properly for a long time. For a moment, Margaret stood there thinking. Then she walked over to him. "Excuse me?" she said gently. The man looked up, surprised. Margaret opened the small bag she was carrying. Inside was a loaf of fresh bread she had just bought. She broke off half of the loaf and offered it to him. The man looked shocked. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. Margaret smiled. "Of course." He accepted the bread slowly. His hands trembled slightly. "Thank you," he said. Margaret nodded and continued walking home. But the moment stayed in her mind. That evening, while she was preparing dinner in her kitchen, she kept thinking about the man at the bus stop. She wondered if he had eaten anything else that day. She wondered how many people walked past him without noticing. Margaret stirred the soup on the stove and looked around her kitchen. There was always enough food, sometimes even too much. She suddenly had an idea. The next morning, Margaret woke up as usual. She made her tea. She opened the kitchen window, and she began cooking. But this time, she did something different. Instead of cooking one portion of food, she cooked two. After she finished preparing breakfast, she placed one portion on a small plate. And then she covered it carefully. Margaret walked to her front door. She opened it slowly. The morning air was cool and quiet. She placed the plate on a small wooden table beside the door. Next to the plate, she left a small handwritten note. The note said only a few simple words. For anyone who needs a warm meal. Margaret returned inside and closed the door. She did not wait to see who would take it. She did not watch through the window. She simply trusted that someone who needed it would find it. That afternoon, when Margaret opened the door again, the plate was gone. In its place, there was a small piece of paper. It had only 2 words written on it. "Thank you." Margaret stood quietly for a moment, holding the note. Then she smiled softly. The next day, she cooked 2 meals again. And the day after that, she did the same. Soon, it became her new daily routine. Every morning, Margaret cooked an extra meal. She placed it on the small table near her door, and she left a short note beside it. For anyone who needs a warm meal. She never asked questions. She never tried to discover who took the food. She simply continued the quiet act of kindness. Days turned into weeks. Sometimes the plate returned empty. Sometimes it returned with another small thank you note. Once, someone left a small flower beside the plate. Margaret placed the flower in a glass of water in her kitchen. She looked at it often while cooking. The quiet routine continued. But Margaret did not yet know something very important. Her small daily act was slowly touching more lives than she could possibly imagine. And the story of the extra meal had only just begun. Margaret continued her quiet routine the next morning. The sun had just begun rising above the rooftops when she stepped into her kitchen. Soft golden light touched the wooden table near the window, the same table where she had prepared thousands of meals over the years. She placed the kettle on the stove and waited for the water to heat. The house was still quiet. Only the ticking clock on the wall and the gentle sound of boiling water filled the room. Margaret poured hot water into her teacup and stood by the window. Across the street, a few neighbors were beginning their morning routines. A man walked his dog slowly along the sidewalk. A young woman hurried toward the bus stop with a bag over her shoulder. Life moved quietly, just like every other morning. And Margaret took a small sip of tea and then began cooking. She chopped fresh vegetables carefully, carrots, potatoes, a little onion. Soon the smell of warm soup filled the kitchen again. Margaret always cooked simple meals, nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just warm, comforting food, the kind of food that made people feel safe. When the soup was ready, she poured 2 bowls, one for herself and one for the small wooden table outside her door. She placed the second bowl on a clean plate, covered it gently. Then she took a small piece of paper and wrote the same message as always. For anyone who needs a warm meal. Margaret opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air was fresh and cool. She placed the meal carefully on the table beside the door and returned inside. She did not stay to watch. She never did. The meal was simply there for whoever needed it. Later that afternoon, Margaret opened the door again. The bowl was empty, and beside it was another small note. This one looked different. The handwriting was uneven, as if written by someone who was not used to holding a pen. The message said only one sentence. "This helped more than you know." Margaret held the note for a moment. Then she folded it gently and placed it in a small wooden box in her kitchen. The box had once belonged to her husband. It used to hold small tools and screws in the garage. But now Margaret used it to keep the note she found beside the plate. There were only 3 notes inside so far, but she kept each one carefully. They reminded her that someone out there had been helped, and that was enough. Days continued passing quietly. Every morning, Margaret cooked 2 meals. Every morning, she placed one meal on the small table outside her door. Sometimes the food disappeared quickly. Sometimes it stayed for hours. But eventually, it was always gone. One rainy evening, something unusual happened. Margaret had just finished washing the dishes when she heard a soft knock at the door. She looked up surprised. Visitors were rare. Margaret walked slowly to the door and opened it. Standing there was a young boy. He looked about 12 years old. His clothes were slightly wet from the rain, and he held the empty plate in both hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the boy looked down shyly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Margaret tilted her head. "Sorry for what?" The boy held the plate forward. "I took the food today." Margaret smiled gently. "That's what it's there for." The boy seemed relieved. "My mom is sick," he explained slowly. "She hasn't been able to work for a few weeks." Margaret listened carefully. "We didn't have much food today," he continued. "When I saw the plate, I took it home." He looked worried again. "I hope that was okay." Margaret's eyes softened. "It was more than okay," she said. The boy hesitated, then asked a quiet question. "Will there be another meal tomorrow?" Margaret nodded without hesitation. "Yes, there will always be another meal." The boy smiled for the first time. "Thank you," he said again. He handed the plate back to her and ran down the steps into the rain. Margaret closed the door slowly. She carried the plate into the kitchen and placed it beside the sink. For a long moment, she stood there thinking. Until that night, Margaret had never known exactly who was taking the meals. But now she knew at least one person, a young boy, and a mother who needed help. The next morning, Margaret woke up a little earlier than usual. She placed the kettle on the stove and began preparing breakfast. But this time, she added something new. She baked fresh bread. The warm smell filled the entire house. When the meal was ready, she placed the bowl of soup, a slice of bread, and a small apple on the plate. Then she wrote a new note. It said only this: "Take what you need." Margaret placed the meal outside and returned to her kitchen. Later that day, when she opened the door again, the plate was empty. But something else had been left behind, a small drawing. It was drawn with colored pencils. The drawing showed a house, a tree, and a small table near the door. On the table was a bowl, and beside the bowl was a smiling stick figure woman. Under the drawing were 2 simple words written carefully: "Thank you." Margaret looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she placed it gently in the wooden box with the other notes. She closed the lid softly. What Margaret did not realize yet was that her small act of kindness was beginning to spread, not just to one person, not just to one family, but slowly, quietly, across the entire neighborhood. And the small table outside her door would soon become something much more important than she ever expected. And the next few weeks passed quietly on Margaret's small street. Each morning followed the same gentle rhythm. The kettle warmed on the stove. Soft sunlight entered the kitchen through the window, and Margaret prepared breakfast with calm, steady hands. But something had changed inside her routine. Now, when she cooked the extra meal, she sometimes imagined the young boy carrying the food home. She imagined him placing the plate on a small table. She imagined his mother sitting nearby, perhaps tired but grateful for a warm meal. Margaret never asked questions. She never tried to follow the boy. But the thought of helping someone directly made her heart feel lighter. So each morning, she prepared the extra meal with even more care. Sometimes it was soup and bread. sometimes rice with vegetables, sometimes pasta with a warm tomato sauce, simple meals, comforting meals, meals that could fill a hungry stomach, and every day, the plate outside the door disappeared. The small wooden box in Margaret's kitchen slowly began filling with notes. Some were written with careful handwriting, some were messy, some had only a few words. One note said, "You made my day better." Another said, "Thank you for thinking of people like us." One day, Margaret even found a small orange placed beside the empty plate. She smiled when she saw it. Someone had given something back. Margaret washed the orange carefully and placed it in a bowl on the table. That evening, she ate it slowly after dinner. Kindness, she thought quietly, had a way of moving from one person to another. One afternoon, Margaret was watering the flowers in her small garden when her neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, walked by. Mrs. Jenkins had lived on the street almost as long as Margaret. She was a friendly woman who always carried a shopping bag and liked to stop for small conversations. "Good afternoon, Margaret," she called from the sidewalk. Margaret waved. "Good afternoon." Mrs. Jenkins stepped closer to the garden gate. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said curiously. Margaret looked up from the flowers. "What is it?" Mrs. Jenkins lowered her voice slightly. "Is it true that you leave food outside your door every day?" Margaret paused for a moment. Then she nodded. "Yes," she said gently. "I cook an extra meal." Mrs. Jenkins looked thoughtful. "My grandson told me he saw someone picking up the plate last week," she said. Margaret smiled. "That's the idea." Mrs. Jenkins crossed her arms and studied Margaret carefully. "You know," she said slowly, "not many people would do that." Margaret returned to watering the flowers. "I just cook a little more than usual." Mrs. Jenkins laughed softly. "Well, it's a lovely thing to do." She began walking again, but stopped after a few steps. "Oh," she added, "you might want to check your table tomorrow morning." Margaret tilted her head. "Why?" Mrs. Jenkins smiled mysteriously. "You'll see." The next morning, Margaret woke up earlier than usual. She prepared her tea and began cooking breakfast. Today she made a warm vegetable stew. She sliced fresh bread and placed it beside the bowl. And when everything was ready, she carried the plate toward the door, but when she opened it, she stopped in surprise. On the small wooden table, there were already 3 small paper bags waiting. Margaret stepped closer. Inside the first bag were fresh tomatoes. Inside the second were potatoes. Inside the third were carrots. There was also a small note. Margaret unfolded it slowly. The message read, "For your kitchen, from your neighbors." Margaret stood quietly for a moment. She looked down the street. A few curtains moved slightly in nearby windows. Someone was watching, but no one stepped outside. Margaret smiled softly. She carried the vegetables into her kitchen and placed them on the table. Then she returned to the door and placed the prepared meal on the wooden table as usual. "All for anyone who needs a warm meal." That afternoon, when she opened the door again, the meal was gone. But another small note remained. This one simply said, "Thank you for helping my mom." Margaret recognized the handwriting. It was the boy's. She placed the note in the wooden box beside the others. Over the next few days, something wonderful began happening. More neighbors started leaving small things on the table in the mornings. Sometimes fruit, sometimes vegetables, sometimes bread. One person even left a small jar of homemade soup. Margaret realized that the small act she had started alone was no longer only hers. The neighborhood had quietly joined her. Now the small wooden table outside her door had become something new. not just a place to give food, but a place where kindness moved quietly between strangers. Margaret continued cooking every morning, but now she sometimes used the vegetables her neighbors left: carrots from one house, tomatoes from another, bread from someone down the street. Each meal became a small creation made by many people. Margaret found great joy in that thought. One evening, as the sun was setting and golden light touched the houses along the street, Margaret sat on the bench in her garden. She looked toward the small wooden table. It was empty now. The meal had already been taken, but beside the table was something new: a small flower growing in a pot. Margaret walked closer. The pot had a tiny note tied to it. She read the words slowly. "Kindness grows here." Margaret placed the flower beside the door where it could receive sunlight. Then she returned to her bench. The street was quiet again. Birds were settling into the trees. Lights began turning on inside the houses. Margaret felt something warm inside her chest. She had only wanted to help one hungry person, but somehow, her small daily meal had begun feeding something much bigger, and the quiet story of the extra meal was only beginning to grow. Spring arrived slowly on Margaret's quiet street. The mornings became warmer. Birds returned to the trees along the sidewalks, and the small garden beside Margaret's house began to bloom again. Yellow flowers appeared first, then soft pink ones opened beside the fence. Margaret enjoyed watching them while she cooked in the kitchen, but the most interesting place on the street was no longer the garden. It was the small wooden table beside her front door. What had once been a simple place for one extra meal had slowly become something very special. Neighbors now left small items there almost every morning: a bag of apples, a loaf of bread, fresh vegetables from someone's backyard, sometimes even homemade soup. Margaret never asked who brought them. She believed kindness worked best when it moved quietly. Every morning she continued cooking. Sometimes she used the vegetables left by her neighbors. Sometimes she added fruit or bread to the plate, and every day someone in need found the meal. Over time, the routine became known around the neighborhood. People walking past the house noticed the table. Some slowed down to read the small note Margaret always placed beside the plate: "For anyone who needs a warm meal." Many people simply smiled and continued walking, but some stopped and thought about it for a moment. One afternoon, the young boy returned again. This time, he was not alone. Beside him walked a thin woman wearing a light jacket. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were kind. The boy knocked gently on Margaret's door. Margaret opened it and recognized him immediately. "Hello," she said warmly. The boy smiled. "This is my mom," he said. The woman stepped forward slowly. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly. Margaret invited them inside. They sat at the kitchen table where Margaret had once served meals to her own family years ago. The woman explained that she had been very sick during the winter. She had not been able to work. Money had become difficult. "Those meals helped us more than you know," she said. Margaret simply smiled. "I'm glad they helped." The boy looked around the kitchen. It smelled like fresh bread again. "You cook every day?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "Yes. I've always loved cooking." The woman looked at Margaret with gentle curiosity. "Why did you start leaving food outside?" Margaret thought about the question for a moment. Then she answered honestly. "One day I saw someone who looked hungry," she said, "and I realized I had more food than I needed." The woman nodded slowly. "That's a rare thing these days." Margaret shook her head gently. "No," she said. "Kindness isn't rare. Sometimes people just need a small reminder." After a short visit, the boy and his mother thanked Margaret again and walked back down the street. Margaret stood at the door watching them go. She felt happy knowing they were doing better. That evening, as the sun slowly disappeared behind the houses, something else happened. A young woman from 2 houses away knocked on Margaret's door. She held a small notebook in her hands. "Hello, Margaret," she said. "I wanted to ask you something." Margaret invited her inside. The young woman looked slightly nervous but excited. "I've been watching what you've been doing with the meals," she said. Margaret smiled. "It's nothing special." The woman shook her head quickly. "I think it is." She opened the notebook and showed Margaret a few pages filled with writing. "I've been talking with some neighbors," she explained. "Many people want to help too." Margaret looked surprised. The woman continued, "We were thinking maybe we could help cook meals sometimes." Margaret blinked slowly. "You mean together?" The woman nodded. "Yes, not to replace what you're doing, but to support it." Margaret felt deeply touched. She had never expected something like this. The small idea that began in her kitchen was now spreading through the neighborhood. "That sounds wonderful," Margaret said softly. Within a few weeks, the idea became real. Some neighbors brought vegetables, some baked bread, some prepared simple dishes at home and placed them on the table. Margaret still cooked every morning, but now she was no longer alone. The small wooden table sometimes held 2 meals, sometimes 3, occasionally even 4. And every day, the food disappeared. No one asked who took it. No one asked how many people were helped. The table had become a quiet promise for anyone who needed support. One afternoon, Margaret noticed something new beside the table. Someone had placed a small wooden sign. She walked closer and read the words carefully. The sign said, "Community table. Take what you need. Leave what you can." Margaret touched the sign gently with her hand. She looked up and down the quiet street. Children were playing near the sidewalk. A neighbor was watering plants. A dog barked softly in the distance. Everything looked normal. And yet, something beautiful had quietly grown here. A simple act of kindness had slowly connected many people. Margaret returned to her kitchen and began preparing the next meal. The smell of warm soup filled the house again. She carried the bowl outside and placed it carefully on the table. Then she adjusted the small sign so it faced the street. For a moment, she stood there quietly. The evening sun warmed her face. The street was peaceful. Margaret smiled to herself. Sometimes the smallest idea could grow into something much bigger than anyone expected. And the small table beside her door was about to change even more lives in ways Margaret could not yet imagine. Summer arrived quietly on Margaret's street. Warm sunlight filled the mornings. The trees along the sidewalk grew thick with green leaves. Children's laughter often floated through the air as they rode bicycles and played outside. And every morning, just as always, Margaret stepped into her kitchen. The kettle warmed on the stove, fresh ingredients waited on the wooden table, and the smell of cooking slowly filled the house. But now the small wooden table outside her door had changed in a way Margaret never imagined when she first placed that single meal there. It was no longer just her table. It had become the neighborhood's table. The small wooden sign remained there every day. Community table. Take what you need. Leave what you can. Some mornings there were 3 meals on the table. Some mornings there were 5. Occasionally there were even more. Different neighbors contributed in their own quiet ways. One family often left homemade bread. Another neighbor brought fresh vegetables from their garden. Someone down the street sometimes left a container of rice and beans. Margaret continued cooking every day, but now she often smiled when she stepped outside. The table had become a symbol of something beautiful, not charity, not pity, but shared care. People helping each other quietly. One afternoon, Margaret was sitting on her garden bench when the young boy ran down the sidewalk toward her house. He looked excited. "Miss Margaret," he called. Margaret looked up with a smile. "Hello there." The boy stopped in front of the bench. "I got a job," he said proudly. Margaret's eyes brightened. "That's wonderful," he nodded enthusiastically. "I help at the grocery store after school now." Margaret could see how proud he felt. "My mom is working again, too," he added. "She's feeling much better." Margaret felt a warm sense of happiness hearing those words. "That's very good news," she said gently. The boy hesitated for a moment. Then he held out something small in his hand. It was a folded piece of paper. Margaret opened it slowly. Inside was another drawing, but this one was much bigger and more detailed than the first. It showed the street, the houses, and the small wooden table. But now the table was surrounded by many people. Some were leaving food, some were picking up meals, and everyone in the drawing was smiling. At the top of the picture, the boy had written a sentence carefully. "This table helps everyone." Margaret looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then she smiled. "I think you're right," she said softly. The boy waved goodbye and ran back down the street. Margaret returned to her garden bench and looked toward the small table again. The afternoon sun rested gently on its wooden surface. 2 plates were sitting there now. Someone had left fresh fruit beside them. Margaret thought about the first day she placed a single meal outside her door. At that time, she believed she was helping just one person. But kindness often moves in ways we cannot predict. It travels quietly from heart to heart, from one small act to another, and slowly it grows. Over the next few months, the story of the small table spread beyond the neighborhood. Visitors sometimes came to see it. Some people simply walked by and smiled. Others quietly left food on the table before continuing their day. But Margaret never wanted attention. She never told reporters. She never posted about it online. For her, the joy was not in being noticed. The joy was in knowing someone hungry could find a warm meal. Years later, the small wooden table was still there. The paint had faded a little. The sign had been replaced once. But the idea behind it never disappeared. Margaret had grown older. Her steps were slower now, but she still cooked most mornings. Sometimes neighbors helped her in the kitchen. Sometimes they delivered the meals themselves. And every day, someone in need found food on that table. One peaceful evening, Margaret sat on her bench and watched the street as the sun slowly set. The sky turned orange and gold. Birds returned to their nests. Lights began appearing in the windows of nearby houses. Margaret looked at the small wooden table one more time. It was empty now. The meals had already been taken. But beside it, someone had left a small flower in a glass jar. Margaret smiled softly. She understood something very simple. Kindness does not need to be loud. It does not need to be large. And it does not need to be famous. Sometimes kindness begins with something very small. A single extra meal, a quiet table near a door, a simple note that says, "For anyone who needs a warm meal." And when people see that kindness, they remember something important. They remember that helping each other is still possible. Thank you for listening to this gentle English story. May it remind you that even the smallest act of care can grow into something meaningful for many people. And sometimes, one extra meal can feed far more than just hunger.